SEWA. It grew out of the trade union movement. It has Gandhian origins. It represents at the moment nearly 3 million self-employed women in 8 provinces in India. And these women, through this trade union, are able to increase their productivity, have a higher income, support their families, support their communities, and they also acquire social security, if you like. They are financially included, they have savings, they buy health insurance. So it's really become a means of growing their own productivity and growing the productivity and prosperity of their families and their community. So and what SEWA does is give them the opportunity, support them in this personal growth, which allows them to become agents of their own success and the success of their families and their community. All of you will be able to say this a lot better than me, but that's just in summary what it is. So why is it important for us? Well, as we think about the role that the World Bank can play in supporting women's economic empowerment, in supporting financial inclusion, in supporting women's leadership, this is an example from which we ought to draw lessons. And that's why I'm absolutely delighted that we have this distinguished panel and this exhibit which shows us a little bit about what SEWA has been doing. The exhibit itself has a unique focus. It focuses not so much on this story that I've been telling you of empowerment. It focuses on resilience. It focuses on how this organization was able to support the large community around itself during COVID-19. COVID-19 was a massive shock, brought a significant death, disruption, loss of livelihoods. But through community-based organizations like SEWA, there was resilience. As we think of resilience in the World Bank, we tend to think of fiscal resilience. We tend to think of infrastructure resilience. You know me, I cover health, education, I think of service continuity. But we don't think so much about community resilience or the community underpinnings of resilience. And that's what this exhibit speaks about. And that's what I hope we're going to be able to get into in today's discussion. Finally, when I first met Rina, our conversation began with this notion of human capital. And what are the elements of human capital that exist beyond the individual? As economists and as development professionals, we think of human capital as something that resides within people. It's their skill, it's their knowledge, it's their agency, all of which is very important. But are there community elements? Is there something about human capital that is supported by the community, that exists in the community? That's the question that was raised in my mind in the conversation with Rina about SEWA. And this is a question that we are considering as a part of our new flagship report on human capital, where we're looking at different arenas in which human capital is built, one of which is the neighborhood, the other is the family, the third is the workplace. And I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about human capital and the community, which extends beyond what is built in the individual. That's a long introduction. I will stop at this point and introduce our very distinguished panelists and moderate a discussion around women's economic empowerment, but also resilience, and hopefully we can get to some of these elements of community and human capital. So so that I don't miss out any of the important introductions, I'm going to look at my sheet. I'm absolutely delighted to first of all introduce Dr. Satchit Balsari. He's an associate professor in emergency medicine at the Harvard Medical School and has had a very distinguished career. What is very interesting is the focus on emergency medicine and development. It's a combination that we don't often see, And he's also the curator of this exhibit. We often don't get medical doctors who curate exhibits. So it's absolutely wonderful to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Second, let me introduce Dr. Rina Agarwala. She is a professor of sociology at Johns Hopkins. She's had a long career, written a number of award-winning books and papers. She also has associated with SEWA for a long time. So you're perhaps the person with the longest association, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from you. Next, let me introduce Shreve, who's the Executive Director of the Global Fairness Initiative. It's an organization that is committed to creating a more just economic order and just labor conditions. And you've also had a long association with SEWA. You were joking with me saying that you actually work for SEWA rather than SEWA as something that associates with you. It's the other way around. So thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. And last but not least, let me welcome Dr. Fatema Sumar. Fatema is the Executive Director of the Harvard Center for International Development. She's had a distinguished career in both government and civil society, and we're absolutely delighted to have her here. Enough from me. Now, let's begin with you, Satchit. What would be terrific for our audience to hear is tell us a little bit about the exhibit that folks are going to see, hopefully after this session, but also later in the week, because the exhibit is going to be running longer. How did it come about? Why did you curate it, and what does it represent? What are some of the key messages that it conveys?
Thank you, Mamta. I'll provide a little context as to why this came about. I am, as Mamta said, an emergency physician. I study disasters and humanitarian responses and have nothing to do with exhibits or art, in fact. SEWA approached us with a very traditional ask. It wanted us to study the impact of the pandemic on the lives of women in the informal sector. It's something we were comfortable doing. So we went in armed with the orthodox instruments of inquiry that all of us are very familiar with, a quantitative survey, a qualitative survey. We surveyed 1,000 households. We then began the qualitative surveys, and we're going to sit down with some of the SEWA members and ask them detailed questions. The questionnaire was about 13 or 14 questions deep. And I speak the language, and I said, let me test it out before the team goes down. And so I went in. And I quickly realized that my notions and my middle-class biases of what the poor meant or how they behaved or what they were capable of were very quickly shattered in the first few minutes of interaction. The women spoke extemporaneously, experientially. They looked you in the eye and spoke for about 45 minutes. I got through about 2 questions in the first 2 rounds, and they spoke very quickly. Their substance to noise ratio was the opposite of my colleagues on campus, and I was going to do no justice trying to capture this in a survey instrument. And so I said, let me record these interviews, let them be free form, and it was only meant for my notes. But coming back to Boston, as the team sat around and watched these women speak, we thought that we really ought not to do what Linda Adcoff said, is speak of them or speak about them, but instead learn to speak with them. And therefore we wanted to bring the story in their voices with the women foregrounded in the storytelling. I also learned very quickly from those few months of interactions with SEWA that I should presume nothing about them and that they will have an opinion about this. So I went back to them and I said, you know, my phone was on when we were speaking and I recorded all this. What do I do with this? Because what I had witnessed were essentially what I felt were these very powerful testimonies of disadvantaged but very empowered women at the start of the 21st century, navigating the greatest public health emergency of our times, when dominant political, social, economic structures around the world fail to protect the poor. And what do we do with these stories? And within seconds, the first response was, go to Geneva. It's like, why do I go to Geneva? And they said, well, tell the ILO about us. And then they said, go to New York and go to DC and show the Indian diaspora what their actions and inactions do to our lives. Come to the cities in India and come back to our villages and tell our neighbors. I was like, I don't think there is a journal that I know that reaches all these people. And I did what Harvard faculty always do when they don't know what to do, is turn to their brilliant students, who are usually much smarter than they are, and they're in the back row here. And a team of them, especially Hitesh Das, suggested we try a traveling exhibition. And so what we have brought here is really an attempt to share with you the stories that we witnessed in the voices of SEWA, augmented by very rigorous science and data that helps tease apart these very deep philosophies that have undergirded their existence for 50 years. You know, it's sort of, I walked away from them realizing that resilience was not $1 million check written by a philanthropic organization, but it was 5 decades of backbreaking work and investment in their communities that allowed them to do this. So I'll leave you with this last, with this quote that I'm hoping will trigger further discussion, which strikes me as one of the most poignant moments in recording these histories. And they're in one of the videos that you will come across. Kapila Ben, one of the grassroots leaders who runs their food distribution network, pauses in the middle of the interview, looks me in the eye and says, you know, we were our own owners, producers, and managers, and we were therefore able to make decisions about our lives that protected us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satchit, and I think you have whetted everyone's appetite to look closely at the exhibit. With that, I am going to turn to Rina next. So Rina, you've engaged with SEWA for a long time, and it would be lovely to hear from you a few words about your association with them and how you came about to be working with them. And then we would be very interested in your reflections on how has SEWA over the years succeeded in supporting so many women. What have, in many dimensions, there's the income growth, there's the social security, there is the financial inclusion. What are some of the unique features of SEWA's model that have allowed them to expand and achieve the outcomes that have been observed?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Mamta and Martin, for organizing this, and thank you, Satchit, for this absolutely gorgeous exhibit. So I first came across SEWA in 1995. I was working in Beijing for the fourth UN World Conference on Women. I was fresh out of college. I really wanted to work for a women's NGO in India. I didn't really know what that meant. I wrote 100 handwritten letters to 100 organizations, and I got one response back. And that was from an organization called SEWA, which was at that time not well known internationally, but they had a very clear project for me to do, so I went. I went there, I flew there, I worked there for a few years. And basically, at that time I worked with Rima Nanavati, who was the head of the rural development arm, and it really changed my life. And so I thought I would just talk briefly about 3 things that, for me, the beauty of SEWA is that it completely rattles your standard ways of thinking about economic development. And so I just thought I'd share 3 examples of how they completely upended my way of looking at the world. And from that day on, I've sort of dedicated my life now to researching informal women, workers, and political organization. The first thing they did was they made women's labor in the informal sector visible. And not just visible as some sideshow, but as a completely necessary and valuable contributor to modern economies. And that was completely transformative at the time. All the economic theories predicted that as an economy grows, we'll have more and more people formally employed with a legal contract, and this traditional, backwards, informal sector where people work under the table will disappear. And we all know that didn't happen in the developing world, and it's not happening even in the developed world, right? The buildings we're sitting in, the phones we're using, all of it is made by people who are not legally protected by any kind of health, labor, or financial regulations. But they were not counted as laborers. They were not counted in labor force surveys, etc. And what SEWA understood, SEWA began in 1972. And so what SEWA understood long before the term informal sector or informal workers or entrepreneurs became popular, what SEWA understood is that this group is never going to go away because we rely on them for everything. The textile Levi's and Tommy Hilfiger rely on the home-based worker who's sitting in her home sewing the pockets of the jeans on. The construction companies rely on these women to manually clean the cement. Middle-class residents rely on these women to sell their fruits and vegetables and collect their garbage and do their domestic work. So this group is never going to go away. And what SEWA did was made them visible to government officials. They literally changed the questions on the National Labor Force Survey to include informal workers as laborers. And when I first began my research, when I spoke to a government official in India, they would say, no, we don't have any informal workers. That's for poor countries, that's backwards. Now you cannot speak to a single government official without them saying, with data, 94% of the Indian labor force works informally. And they then went on to work with Harvard and the ILO and the International Consortium of Labor Statisticians to change other countries' labor force surveys as well. And by making this metric so visible in government policies and in labor force surveys, they also made it visible to the women themselves. So often when labor force survey officials would come to the door and ask, what do you do for a living? How do you generate income? These women would say, we don't work. Because that's what they've been told to say. They sit in their homes, you just earn money for your hairpins, you don't have a legal contract. But SEWA gave them the dignity and the power to say, we are workers and the economy relies on us. So therefore we need to be visible, we need protection, etc. The second thing that SEWA did to totally upend my way of thinking was it completely turned around how we think about labor organization. All the theories of labor organizing said that you can only unionize when you are formally employed, when you have the right to strike, when you have a contract. And SEWA said, why? Informal workers can organize. And Ela Butt, the founder of SEWA, started a union, as Mamta said, in 1972 of informal workers because the formal textile union would not allow them in the union. They said these are not workers, although they relied on these women for all of their work. And what's so fascinating, one of my favorite quotes of Ela Butt is the title of her book, and the title of her book came from one of the SEWA members, where she said, we are poor, but we are many. And what SEWA did to make use of their numbers is not just form a union, which is remarkable in and of itself, but it's far more innovative because she also understood that because they don't have the legal right to strike, they don't have as much bargaining power as a formal worker. So what do these women do when they want to fight for greater minimum wages or whatever? They've also formed a cooperative. So the SEWA model is a joint action of unions and cooperatives. So when they are striking, they have their own cooperatives to turn to for self-sufficiency, democratizing ideals, and income generation. We just finished, a student of mine and I just finished a review of organizational structures across the world, and to this day the SEWA model is completely unique, and it doesn't need to be unique. It's totally replicable. But it is an absolutely revolutionary and innovative way of offering not only empowerment and mass organization, but also self-sufficiency and democratization. democratizing ideals to the poorest workers in the world. And then my final point I just want to say is that SEWA gives dignity by giving power. And I think what was so fascinating to me is that SEWA has redefined, at least to me, what poverty is. Poverty is not just income or lack of income. It's not just lack of capability or lack of education. It's lack of power. And that quote I was so happy to see is in the exhibit, that poverty is powerlessness. And that is what SEWA attends to. That is what SEWA does. It actually gives power and dignity to poor women through collective actions. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rina. That was absolutely fascinating. Unionization amongst the informal, the model, the union plus cooperative, and then the empowerment. Empowerment because poverty is about powerlessness. Those are really amazing insights. You also said that there's something very unique about the model which has not been replicated. And very often at the World Bank we think about replication, and we think also about scaling. So I'm going to scale. I think SEWA is at scale. 3 million is a lot across 8 states. So maybe I won't go down the scaling question. But the replicability question is an important one to us. And to our audience. So I'm going to ask this of, I'm going to turn to you, Caleb, now. We heard that the model is very unique and grew sort of out of the Indian context. That being said, there are elements that have been exported elsewhere. And there are transferable lessons from SEWA. Could you say a little bit about about the experience of exporting this model elsewhere, and how has it worked, and what has it achieved?
Of course. And Rina teed up a lot of the key elements of what SEWA has done so successfully, and I would argue that so many are transferable. They are unique in many ways, but not just unique to SEWA, unique perhaps to informal workers. So I run an organization, it's an international NGO. I think the first time I went to Gujarat was maybe 20 years ago. I am certainly the least comfortable representing SEWA up here or anywhere. But our work is guided almost entirely by SEWA these days. And I think the question of what is transferable, the list goes on and on and on. But I'll touch on 3 things that I think are sort of key. The first is self-reliance. If you talk to any SEWA member or SEWA leadership, self-reliance is the word you will hear almost more than anything. And self-reliance is many different things, but it is really about nurturing livelihoods. It's about really owning the livelihoods of the supply chains you're in and so on. And at multiple levels, SEWA runs remarkable social enterprises at quite a scale that are sophisticated enterprises, but ultimately it's about that home-based worker, that woman who runs her own enterprise. This self-reliance is a very transferable thing, we think. 10 years ago or so, actually under a World Bank South-South facility, we brought a team of SEWA grassroots leaders to northern Ghana to work with a cooperative of shea producers. Women who were collecting shea at a small level, adding value to it, and who were saying, we need help, we need more entry into the supply chain, we want to own a bit more of what the middlemen do. SEWA went over and they said, stop worrying about who else is involved in this, and just worry about your ownership of it. What do you get to control about this? They focused on self-reliance, on nurturance of the livelihoods, on owning the livelihoods. I should say, I really appreciate the bank's leadership in creating this South-South exchange. These things are very important, and obviously transferability, as we talk about SEWA, is often bringing SEWA to places where they can speak directly to peers. And that's a very powerful thing, I think, when you find women producers, formal sector women producers, sitting with each other, recognizing the shared challenges, the shared opportunities. It's a very powerful thing, and it really does change it, certainly more than someone like me going there and talking about SEWA. So if you were to talk to members of Paksung now, they run a very successful enterprise at multiple levels. Are they selling product? The sophistication of the value add they have and the price point of their products is quite remarkable. Each of them will say that self-reliance, ownership of the supply chain, really being in charge of what we own was a key part of their success. Organizing, which you mentioned, is probably one of the most powerful things that SEWA's demonstrated. SEWA is, of course, a worker movement, but SEWA organizes really to nurture their members. SEWA is focused not on necessarily influencing policy or changing sort of attitudes within the labor movement, not a sort of formal traditional labor movement. They're all about how can they serve and nurture their members. And with that comes a great deal of empowerment to nurture movements, to put women in leadership roles, to define what worker empowerment really is, not just within the Indian context, but within a global context in the informal sector. I think that COVID taught us something or created a narrative that that's really created a movement. We started thinking about essential workers not just as frontline workers, not just as the health care providers and so on. We started thinking about essential workers as the person who made sure that that tomato was on the shelf at the grocery store. In the Western context, that person who delivered those groceries to your door. Those informal workers, as Rina talked about, not protected, no security elements, but still were so essential to our ability to keep economies churning through COVID. Those workers are organizing now. Those workers are recognizing their power. So non-traditional labor unions are growing everywhere. We work a great deal in Africa, and we are really struck by how many worker-led unions are growing, very often women-led. And this sort of nurturing members model that SEWA brings, of really understanding your workers, organizing workers around what their goals are, and then playing the role of leading that. Those unions are starting to play a significant role in influencing policy, and that is part of the goal, but I think livelihood is the fundamental goal. And maybe this leads into one last piece, which is sort of not a expected or traditional one we talk about with SEWA, and that's data ownership. SEWA knows their members more than anyone. Nobody needs to parachute into Gujarat and extract data to tell SEWA what they need in order to change the economic condition of their members. They produce the data, they know their members, they own the data, and they'll tell us what to do. You know, our organization doesn't come in with preconceived notions or develop agendas based on how we see or what data we see. And then there's a powerful data out there that SEWA also draws from, of course, that's data produced here. But they're the ones who own it, apply it to their work, and they, you know, we brought SEWA over a year ago to actually do training on grassroots data collection in Kenya, working with transportation workers, metal workers, all informal sector workers. SEWA came, did trainings on how to run focus groups, enumeration, data collection. Those workers ran the focus groups, developed the questionnaires, went out and collected the data with the workers who were part of their communities that produced reports that they validated. It wasn't me or my organization going in and then taking it and producing a report. The final sign-off on that report was those workers. It was all built around a SEWA ethos of grassroots data collection and owning that data to influence the larger development agenda, the trade agenda, but most importantly, the agenda of their members around livelihoods. So I think data is an important part of what SEWA can bring to other places. We've launched an initiative called the Inclusive Labor Institute that is really just trying to build capacity amongst non-traditional worker-led organizations, often SEWA coming over, to train them on how to collect data, how to understand their members, and really trying to create a global movement around grassroots-led data collection. So those of us don't have to go in there and extract it. We really are listening at the grassroots level. I think those are sort of some of the key things we feel are things SEWA can take forward and take export.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Self-reliance, organization, nurturing leadership, and data. I think you've identified very clearly as four transferable lessons, and amongst many. Thank you very much for that. So Fatema, we're going to turn to you and now want to broaden the discussion beyond SEWA, what's replicable, what can everyone learn, and relate it to the big conversation that everyone is having about supporting women's economic empowerment. So what do you see as the implications of what SEWA has achieved for the international discourse on women's empowerment? What lessons might there be for multilateral organizations, multilateral banks, including our own? What should we be doing differently? What should we be doing more of? As I mentioned, we have an ambitious gender strategy, which is trying to take some of these ideas forward. What is your advice for us?
So I'm gonna now that we're all best friends here, I'm gonna share a little bit. I got a root canal yesterday. It's my first one. I have another one next week. And they spent an hour plus drilling. I don't know what they were doing actually. Satchit, I'm gonna have to ask you later what was actually happening. But my mind started wandering throughout this hour to kind of kill time. And a song that popped into my mind as I was thinking about today and what we were gonna be talking about, and having read through everything, having seen this exhibit earlier when it was up in Cambridge at Harvard, the song that popped into my mind was Tracy Chapman. Any of you know Tracy Chapman? All right, do you know the one, and I'm not gonna sing it because I'm not gonna embarrass myself while this is being recorded, but the one where she's talking about a revolution. And if you listen to the lyrics of that song, what I think she's talking about is the experience of growing up here in the United States in a very poor urban setting, alcoholic parents, broken families, trying to just make it as a grocery store clerk counter. Very living hand to foot, paycheck to paycheck. And she talks about how one day poor people are gonna rise, and what we're really talking about is a revolution. So that was a song that was going through my head. And as I was listening to those lyrics in my head, another thing popped into my mind, which I want to connect here, which is I've now become obsessed. I love history. I've been obsessed with the Empire podcast. And if you listen, now there's like 219 episodes now. I'm on like number 18. But the first one, which is really what struck and got me hooked, is they talk about how the East India Company, when they first came in the 1600s to India, and if you look at what was happening in the 1600s, which is so relevant actually to the conversation we're having today, because everything is cyclical in history. You know, when you think about what was happening in the 1600s in Bihar in particular, and how it was the richest place in the world was Bihar at that time, which is ironic given where Bihar is today. And it was over textiles. And it was the textile industry and women in particular in these textile industries. And when the East India Company came for this podcast, they were able to subjugate India. Do you know how many soldiers? Anyone want to take a guess? In my head, it was thousands and tens of thousands of British soldiers that subjugated India. It was about 30 officers from the East India Company, is what we were talking about. When we talk about revolution, sometimes, and in this context of gender, sometimes I think we need a lot of people, we need a lot of money, and sometimes you need 30 officers from the East India Company, because it's not about the numbers, it's about when there's so many divisions, when you don't have community resilience, when you have such fractured communities that are going to turn against each other, authoritarian regimes can come in, divide and conquer very, very easily with very little. And when I think about the world today that we are inheriting, when I think about the changes that are going to be happening, that are already happening in so many places, including what will happen here in the United States and around the world, I think one of the things I'm really struck by, Mamta, is we have been trying this now in multilateral spaces for years. We've certainly, in my experience in the US government, working in the State Department, bilateral aid agencies, working very closely with our multilateral partners. When we think about these strategies, when we think about these approaches, the question I really have is, why is this so hard? Because many of us are economists in the room. We all rely on the data, we rely on the evidence. We all know the facts. Like, when I was putting this together, my team put together 37 facts to me that I can tell you about what the gaps are in general. But we all know them. It's not that we don't have the data, that we don't have the evidence. So here's what I came up with. I looked at your strategy last night. I came up with 6 C's of my best advice to think about for both the World Bank and beyond. So my first 3 C's come from SEWA, and it's really from this exhibit. So I went through Satchit, this incredible, I hope you guys get a chance to see this with Satchit afterwards, and this team. I came up with 3 C's of how we could think about the strategy and successful implementation of the strategy. So from SEWA, first, who's at the center? Who are we really putting at the center of these strategies? Oftentimes, it's us as the implementing partner or the funder. It's about our needs, our shareholders, our boards, and our risk. And so we have the strategies, but it has to meet our needs. We all have this problem, whether you're in the INGO sector, whether you're in government, bilateral agencies, development, multilateral agencies. Can we shift the center of the strategy to not the home institution, but to the communities that we're actually thinking about? That changes risk profiles, it changes how you go to the board, it changes how we do measurement and who counts. So the second C I would have is who counts. I think what we've heard even on this stage today, but what we know from the SEWA example, is there was this massive movement in SEWA, and really, what I'm taking away from one of the things you said so powerfully is, SEWA changed the way we think about who counts, right? And we have to be doing that rapidly at scale everywhere. How do we get to decide who counts too, right? Many of you are here in the room. You are the ones that literally will be pulling the data and making decisions on who counts. Can we be more provocative? As leaders, when I was in the Millennium Challenge Corporation, I did oversight of all of our compacts. When we went to the board, when we went to our investment committees to look at what the data sets were showing us, can we be more provocative in challenging our economists on who counts in the data and how that's captured? The third piece, the third C is, what do we actually mean by community? So when we think about communities, if we're going to shift the focus and the loci from individuals to communities, what do we mean by that? And do we get to define that, or who gets to define what a community really is? Because oftentimes, even this definition in the decision-making space still comes back to us, and those of us that are writing, defining, implementing, and monitoring the policies and programs. So that's on the front end of what I'm taking away from this conversation. The 3 C's I'd offer, my 3 + 3 = 6 here moment, that I've thought a lot about when I was on the design, implementation, and evaluation side, is first, when we think about, it's all about change on the 3 C's. The first is structural change. So one of the things that I'd love to see more of is, as you think through implementation, and you have some great pillars here around GDP, human capital, expanding economic opportunities, and women's leadership. Can we move from a projectized approach for how we do implementation to thinking through structural change? Because when we keep projectizing everything, we really lose how to think about the structure as a whole and how to think through institutional change, which starts here at home in Washington. We can't ask our partners to do what we're not willing to do. I look at our strategists a lot. When I was at Oxfam, I used to say this a lot. We're asking our partners to do something that Oxfam's not able to do. And we measure and we fund them against that. The second C on this, I would say systemic change. And again here, when we think through systemic change, there's some incredible research. If you look at the research by Natalia Agarwala at Harvard Business School, Michaela Carlana at the Kennedy School, but many others, around social norms and the power of social norms. Oftentimes, this again does not get captured in our economic analysis. What it's going to take, whether that's social behavior change or the structural and social norms that are going to really be required. And I think, again, the SEWA model here is very powerful because what you've all shared in your journeys with SEWA, whether they're short-term or long-term, and what we've seen from SEWA here, is at the end of the day, what they really created in these communities is social cohesion. It was changing social norms to make it acceptable for women to count in this way. And there's something very powerful about that. And the final C I would offer on change is sticky change. You know, for this to work, we have to make the strategies and the changes that come from within so sticky that they withstand political transitions. So they have to outlast 4-year cycles, whether that's in the United States, in Europe, or elsewhere. And oftentimes I worry that we're so geared towards what's coming in Washington or the broader political cycles of our funders and the donors that we don't design programs that are going to outlast the politics of it. And so really thinking through revolutionary change is revolutionary because it's sticky. And even if you don't like it, it's hard to undo. And I'd love for us to really think about stickiness. And stickiness to me is being more revolutionary up front and shaking up that system. And so anyway, when I do my second root canal next week, I'm going to be thinking now about all of this and this conversation to come back and reflect. So let me pause there.
Thank you very much. I think you have set I think there's plenty for you to think about during your next root canal. Let me just put it that way. It's very interesting what you say about designing things to outlast the political cycle. Martin and I this afternoon are going to be at a technical briefing with the board of the World Bank, some of whose members are represented here, precisely about trying to design our support as the World Bank group in a way that outlasts political cycles. So what you say, I think is resonating very much. I'm being told that I have to get through a second round of questions quickly because we are a little over time, but that's because I think we've been dwelling so much on the substance and the experience and what lessons we can draw from the experience of SEWA. But let me turn to a quick round for each of the panelists, and this time I want to focus on this idea of community resilience, and I would like to ask each of you to just look at the panel at the back, which talks about an economy of nurturance. This is a term that has been used about SEWA right from its inception. And this is really about creating a way of associating economically as Homo economicus, which is about sharing, growing together and sharing together, and not so much about profit seeking and profit taking. So I would love each of you to reflect on this idea of nurturance and what that means for resilience. I know in each of you sort of represents a different path of life, right? Each of you has done different things. How is this idea featured? How does it speak to you? And what do you see as its implications? So I'm going to start with you, Satchit. I'm going to follow the same order.
Thank you. The first thought I have is that I will prescribe all my patients a root canal. It seems to be really too good for the mind. I'm going to step away from SEWA a little bit and be brief. My work has taken me to refugee settings around the world, which I think is an extreme example of deprivation in today's world. And as you were all speaking about nurturance, I was thinking about the world that we have set up for the most destitute amongst us. I was just outside the Zadri refugee camp in Amman, where the Syrian refugees were, interviewing this family. There was this big, burly Middle Eastern man with his wife and 3 kids, and they had 2 cups of china in their house that they had managed to run with, and we were 3 of us, embarrassed because they had to serve tea to 2 of us and then wash the cup and come back. And as he was speaking, the man broke down and he said, you know, I don't need any aid, I don't need any assistance from any of you, I just want to work. And I think what organizations like SEWA and their economy of nurturance have been able to do is invest in their communities. This exhibit ends with an installation on climate change and how extreme weather is impacting their families. And I think institutions like the bank and other powerful institutions that right now are poised to think hard about what these conversations internationally mean about loss and damages and reparations and thinking the poor in the global south do not need aid, they need work, right? I think we have to reimagine how these billions of dollars that we are going to invest or mobilize across these institutions reach those that need it most. And there are so many barriers right now because the systems, the systematic change that you were talking about, still are very top-down. We talked about this last evening and this morning. We're talking about multilateral agencies dealing with this state, but where the vast majority are not able to tap into this. And I think there is an opportunity over the next few years to really reimagine how we work with those who are fully capable of driving their own change. And that was sort of one of the largest lessons for me. I want to take a quick 10 seconds, because the thank yous always get left out, for this extraordinary opportunity. This exhibit continues to travel to many locations, but where these conversations are had is very important to SEWA. And SEWA is not here because of any blindsides from our side. It happens to be the month where they have their annual board meeting, and so they just cannot travel. It wasn't the snow. But on behalf of SEWA and Horrible and GFI and our teams, we're very grateful, first for this gorgeous space that Martin invited us to, and for all the help that Martin's team and Mamta's team, and especially Katie, have provided. It allows institutions like SEWA to come whole space here for a while and to have these conversations. So we're very grateful to be given this opportunity.
Okay, so I think to me what is at the seed of the economy of nurturance is understanding that in addition to income and GDP, what we need as a society is security. And that is something that when SEWA formed in '72, they understood what it meant to have a precarious life. They understood what it meant, all the damages that come with precarity and insecurity. And what SEWA created was security for their members, which is a large member base. So they understood the importance of security and resilience long before COVID-19. The difference, though, between the 70s and today is that in the 70s, the top, the government, the systems, the politics, actually also strove to create security. It's just that the informal sector was left out of that 20th century contract. The saddest and scariest part about the current moment is that we're not even striving for security. In fact, before COVID-19, we were valorizing flexible employment and self-sufficiency and all of these things. I think COVID-19 threw the mask off of how horrible insecurity is, not just for the poor, but also for the wealthy. And that is where I think SEWA, an organization that has been working on security and nurturance for decades, has now something to teach the world that the world is finally, I think, willing to hear. And that's why I think the economy of nurturance is basically a guiding light for our future.
So I'll take a slightly different approach, which is maybe to make an ask regarding the economy of nurturance. We are working with SEWA right now to begin a listening process of defining what the economy of nurturance looks like at a macro level, a sort of post-neoliberal, feminist-led economic model. And that macro model will be really interesting. I think the learning we have through it is important, but they will be the first to say that the economy of nurturance is a local reality. The larger vision is important, but everywhere, every worker group, every woman is going to have a nurturance model that is appropriate to them, that maybe lives with larger themes, but ultimately is a locally based approach to economic growth and stability and security. And so my ask would be really be open-minded and more than anything listen. This is going to look and sound very different than some of the models we hear. There's going to be, discord in some places because it is so localized. But being open-minded, listening, really localizing the approaches to economic development, I think is probably the key thing in an economy of nurturance. I think over the next year or two, we'll have something people can look at that will give some general themes, but the most important piece of this is going to be get down to the local grassroots level and really hear what that economy looks like for the people who are living it.
So I also want to add my thanks. It's such an empowering way for, I think, all of us to start this new year. So really thank you to the World Bank for hosting and having us here. One of the things I'm really struck by when I look at these beautiful imagery here and the stories from SEWA is that what SEWA is teaching us is that we have the power to scale with localization. And there are models at local levels, both in India and elsewhere, that we know that we can scale up. As we think through that scale journey, and I think about the quote, the economy of nurturance, I wonder how we transition that into the work that we all do to a political economy of nurturance, which is slightly different in that nuance, because it brings in then the political structures, the systemic structures, the structural pieces, including the political elite that have to be part of that conversation in order to create space, resources, for this to really happen at scale. And I think what we're missing in some ways is that we have communities of resilience, but these communities of resilience, it's almost a resilient against us. They're resilient against the capture of what the political elite has done to them. And that division, if it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger with the challenges we're facing globally, whether that's the challenges with even in India alone, if you have 1 out of every 3 workers being a migrant, for instance, which this exhibit brings out so powerfully, with people on the move in the greatest scale we've ever seen in human history, with what we are already seeing with climate and will continue to see with climate, with the rise of authoritarianism, and I mean what we're seeing with the receding of democratic norms everywhere, including here in the United States, in Europe, but also in places like India, right, where this is happening. Communities of resilience cannot just be resilient because they're trying to escape us. And I worry a little bit about what they're resilient against. And it really should be a call to action to all of us about our own individual and institutional roles in that system of elite political capture, and what we really need to do differently to be part of these movements, supporting these movements, and not just strengthening movements to be stronger because they can't survive otherwise in the systems that we're creating, if that makes sense. And I wanted to just end with a quote from the exhibit, actually, if that's okay, because this is one of the quotes that really strikes me. I think I'll let it be for your scavenger hunt of where this shows up in the exhibit. But in her book, Anuban, Building 100-Mile Communities, the late Ilan Bhatt describes what she calls the economy of nurturance, and this is what she said. She said, it plunders neither human nor natural capital, but instead restores it and grows it. And I think that's our call to action. That's what really I take away as what we all can do here. I think that's the work I know the bank is trying to do in their new gender strategy and beyond in South Asia and globally, and I hope that's the journey we're all on. So thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Those were very interesting and insightful comments. As an economist and a development professional, I'm taking away the idea of economic models that support community resilience. And we may not quite have that as yet, is what I'm taking away from your responses. Okay, I'm looking at Katya now. Do we have time for a few questions? No, we don't. Okay, so we go, all right, very good. I know Wempi wanted to ask a provocative one, and I know that Dina had a question in mind about One Health. So can they ask their question so that we leave them in the minds of the panelists, and then we turn to Martin for closing remarks.
Thank you, Mamta. Thank you for very encouraging and very impressive presentations. My name is Murthi from Indonesia. I'm Executive Director for Southeast Asia, representing 11 countries. I just want to ask very short 2 questions, actually. You talked about the so-called structural changes and systemic changes, but on the view of the governments, actually, most of it comes from the governments, and also the World Bank dealing with the governments, as you know. So what are the necessary conditions of these structural changes and system changes that the government should understand from the SEWA and can learn about? And we'd like to connect what Satchit mentioned, learn to speak with them. So what kind of the strategy you can advise maybe some of the colleagues here that the government should increase the ownership as well as the awareness of this program? Thank you.
Shall we get a couple of questions, and this will give you some time to think about them?
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to change my question to another question provoked by your discussion. In many of our countries, the programs for women's economic empowerment has been focused more on the rural poor, or the rural women who are poor. But now there's a huge challenge also of the urban poor that has received less attention. So I was wondering what would be your thoughts on how to bring the programs now to address the increasing challenges of the urban poor, especially the women in urban areas.
Any more questions? And here?
Thanks for a fascinating presentation. So the big takeaway that I had was to think about SEWA as a labor movement rather than a women's movement. And I hadn't thought of it that way, and what SEWA is trying to do is to address a group of labor that isn't addressed in traditional labor movements, and addressing it in ways that are different from traditional labor movements. So this is important for the informal sectors that we have in all our countries, but also for the future of work in some ways, because traditional labor movements won't address them. The question I had then is, that won't work if it's just a women's movement, right? Because there are lots of informal men, and there will be in the future. So just your thoughts on how we think about this. And the other is coming back to the replicability question. Is SEWA replicable without Ilapat? I mean, it's such a unique thing. So.
All right, and then who would like to take the first question? I'm leaving the microphones with you.
I think it would be good to take a crack at responses, and then hopefully we will have time for Martin to give us some conclusions, and we can wrap up. Thank you for these thought-provoking questions. So take your pick about which ones you want to respond to.
I'd love to just address the final question, because I feel like a professor when a student actually got exactly the point I hope to get out there, and I love that landed. SEWA is a labor movement, absolutely. It happens to be very focused on women, but as we replicate and as we transfer, it absolutely should address others, not just women. And primarily because the type of labor that SEWA has so brilliantly organized is now not just for women. It is the norm. And so I really appreciate your point about the future of work. In fact, the annual sociological meetings this year, the whole theme is the future of work. We all know the future of work is going to look very different from what the ideal of work was in the 1970s when SEWA began. And it just so happens that the model that SEWA put forth in the 70s has now become, as I was saying earlier, the necessary model for the future of work, not just for women, but men, and not just for the poor, but also for the skilled, to your point about human capital, and not just for India, but also for the US. So this is going to become the way work is organized, and SEWA knows how to nurture and organize and generate income for that type of work. So absolutely, it should address men. Having said that, we are also living in a system where men and women are not having equal power relations, and so SEWA will, I think, remain committed to addressing the gender relations that intersect with the labor relations and focus on women. And I just want to answer quickly your question about Ilaben's replicability. Once again, I think Ilaben's innovation is just incredible. She had the foresight, which is very rare among founders of movements or organizations, to step down before she was forced to step down. And so when she was very, in good health, etc., she stepped down and created a rotating leadership model in SEWA to make sure that SEWA itself can sustain itself without Ilaben. And therefore, and as Caleb knows better than me, but they have worked for decades on replicating or at least transferring some knowledge to other organizations where Ilaben is not there. So it is very much envisioned as a model that is not reliant on, it's trying to get away from this idolization of one personality. It is a movement, it's sticky, and hopefully now it's going to be spread.
Maybe I can take on the government one. So I'm glad you raised this. This is so fundamentally important everywhere. Trying to identify the benefits to government, why to work closely with the informal sector. SEWA's been very savvy about how to do so. Labor market transparency is an important one. Listen to those sectors in the informal economy. Get the questions on your household labor surveys, understand what those questions should be within the context of your economy that you're working with. I think listening for government is a big part of this, but there's also huge benefits in terms of the organizing. It's not a risk, which I think is often seen within labor movements, that it's going to become political. COVID clearly demonstrated that governments weren't able to reach the majority of their citizens with the benefits and services and relief efforts. And that was because there's no transparency in the formal sector. There just isn't organizing there. But it actually is there if you're willing to get them to the table, if you're willing to listen to sort of grassroots leaders, the worker-led organizations. And that, and the sort of some of the best success stories, and SEWA was actually a good example. Those services were delivered through informal sector organized labor organizations, non-traditional labor organizations, but get government to recognize this partnership. And there's nothing wrong with formalization, right? You don't focus on the revenue side, that always has risk. But the formalization in order to kind of create, get everyone under the same tent, the services you develop and invest in as a government to make sure those reach everyone means you create systems to get under that umbrella. And you need partnerships with informal sector leadership to get there. So I think government's an important player, and it's just being sophisticated about the benefits. I do think the data side is very important. Informal sector worker organizations regularly feel like they come to government has all these statistics and tells them what everything's like. They don't have their own, and they feel disempowered to be able to make a case. The more that data is shared between them, I think that sort of creates empowerment on both sides. But that's how I think about it.
I'll just come in really fast to add to that. I mean, I think there's so much here when we talk about structural changes for governments. I have to say, I'm increasingly a big believer when we think about structural norms and changes around what conditionality could look like. At MCC, actually, we did this in force around legislation in particular, of things that we expected around disbursements, around key legislative movements and milestones, but also things around where things we thought needed to get privatized or not. Now, there's a lot of history and there's a lot of opinions around that are, I can't do in 30 seconds up here. is something here around a lot of our conversations often are at the projectized level with governments around project X, Y, or Z. Certainly I've been in my fair share of those meetings, I'm sure all of you have as well. We miss something there when we're always at that project level that is harder to kind of step back and abstract away from. The second piece I wanted to say, I just wanted to tie this back to your gender strategy on your third pillar, because I was really struck that you put right in there something that we all know to be so true but is often missing, which is women as leaders, and how we actually get there, and how we're going to get there with particularly the fact that we're seeing already such attacks around diversity, inclusion, belonging, and what that's going to mean for women's participation and representation. Even tying this back to the government structures and meetings, I cannot tell you in my career how many meetings I've been a part of at senior levels with ministers, with heads of state, with other senior officials. I'm literally still the only female in that room, right? On either side, whether representing the United States or my NGO or in conversations with that government. We could also shake up much more strategically who's on our side of the table, and our side of the table not just by gender, but also which organizations we bring into these elite political spaces. I've done this in meetings where I actually invite some of the very organizations to just join me, and so I'm not speaking for them, but they're with me in that conversation, because otherwise the government's never going to hear from them, and they're never going to meet with them. And so we hold enormous political power on our side of this table. We need to start shaking up who's actually at that table and using our power differently. I've set this up on our campus too. I can't believe that we're in 2024 and so many of our meetings on campus are still all men on both sides, and the photos are all men that are still coming out. You know, sometimes we're thinking a lot about how to help partner countries make the transition and the journeys. I think we have to do much more accelerated on our side too, for where this starts from, and then, you know, have some of those downstream conversations as well. So just to say, a lot of this I think is doable. The strategies are there, the intent is there. I think we have great partners in place. But to make it really sticky, I do think these changes are going to require really some of the most obvious things sometimes that we just keep talking about but not really doing something about as well. And whether that's like the structural pieces around legislation, the policy analysis, the data collection, we know the different kind of policy levers and the policy tools, how we pull them, where we decide to pull them all together at the same time, and also in coordination. I mean, if the bank is pulling one lever, but the bilateral agencies that are most at play are not, it sends a lot of mixed signals in the system. And we see this in many country settings, right? Where the bank is pushing something, but the lead bilateral donor agency is not for political reasons, and vice versa. So we're gonna have to get our ducks in a row, I think, a little bit. I know we've been trying that in terms of donor coordination. But these are the things where I think when we do it really well, we've seen lots of success, and we have great success stories there. And I think those are the learnings that we need to think about applying in the other country contexts as well.
The vicissitudes of poverty have not allowed SEWA to mourn 11's passing. They've had to move on with their lives. But they came up with a solution to fill this hole that you alluded to. As she was being cremated, SEWA decided that the nara, the call that would go up, is Har Ben, Ila Ben. Each sister is now Ila's sister, Ila Ben, right? And words matter. And it was so incredibly empowering for the organization that for months later, when we visited, as they would tear up, they would say, but we are now Ila Ben. And there is a sense that they will survive.
So I guess, Martin, it now falls upon you to give us your concluding remarks.
Not much for me. We've had a great discussion. I just want to thank everybody who worked on making the organization of this possible. I want to start with put your hands together for Katie, because she's done a lot. And I want to thank Satchit for reaching out with this idea as soon as you did. I thought it would be great to bring this exhibition here. In South Asia, we've been running now for about a year, a campaign that we call Clear Her Path. And the idea was we wanted a way to put attention to the fact that in South Asia, still to this day, only less than a third of women are in the labor force, and that includes the revised ILO definition, it includes informal work. So we feel we needed to draw attention to this issue, and we wanted to have partnership with research organizations, with civil society, to try and bring this on the political agenda, to try and get dialogue with government about what are the structural impediments. We've had a couple of successes for legislative changes in Sri Lanka, I think in Bangladesh as well, on things that we were trying to push through our development policy credits that would help reduce some of the barriers. And it's, I mean, there's no mystery, effectively, because the legal norms, the regulations in South Asia are still among some of the most prohibitive for women to have an equal access to employment opportunities. But my biggest takeaway from this is that it's so much more than about female labor force participation. That's the statistic, but really what counts is the agency and the empowerment that comes with that. And that takes us into, for the World Bank, somewhat less familiar and uncomfortable terrain. Talking about power is not something that we like to do. We do it all the time, very implicitly in, you know, quiet meetings and phone calls, etc. But the reality is a lot of what happens in development is about power. And we are not neutral to that. Whatever we do as a development institution influences the relations of power, whether in the household, whether in the community, whether in the polity. And I think this discussion was a really nice way to bring this point out and to encourage us to engage with this even when it's difficult. So I'll just leave you with that thought. But I really enjoyed the panel discussion, and I think, Satchit, you're now offering to take us around the exhibition. So for those of you who still have a few minutes to spare, I really would encourage you to join me and Satchit to have a walk around. And thank you all very much for